I'm Jim Schaefer, host and executive producer of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Leslie Stainton, who's appearing on this program for a second time. In this conversation, we're going to discuss her latest book, Staging Ground, an American Theater and Its Ghosts. Welcome to Rip Rap.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
It's an interesting book, but first we need to establish what you're talking about. Where is this theater? How long has it been around? Just that kind of stuff.
It's the Fulton Theater in my hometown of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and it is arguably the oldest continuously operating theater in the United States. The original Fulton Hall, which became the Fulton Theater, was built in 1852, but the foundations of the theater are the stone walls of the colonial jail that was built in Lancaster roughly between 1730 and 1745. And so this is a particularly old building and a particularly ghosted building because of what took place in that jail back in the 18th century.
And plus, what's underneath it, right?
Underneath the jail?
Yeah, the Native American.
Well, yes, they're not actually underneath it. We don't quite know what happened to their bodies or bones, but the story, that's an extraordinary story and a huge part of early American history, is that in 1763, during Pontiac's rebellion, the last 14 members of the Conestoga Indians who lived in Lancaster County, and by that point they were poverty-stricken peddlers who were no threat whatsoever to any colonists. But a group of vigilantes on the border, or the frontier, the American frontier at that point, which was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they were terrified of these Indians in their midst. And so actually in early December of 1763, they rode into Lancaster County. They went to effectively the reservation where the Conestoga Indians were living. They massacred the 6 Conestogas whom they found there that morning on a snowy December day, and then they left. And the Lancaster officials rounded up the 14 surviving Conestogas who actually had been out peddling baskets that morning. They took them into the colonial jail in downtown Lancaster ostensibly for their safety. Locked them up inside that jail/workhouse. And then a couple of weeks later, on December 27th, while ironically the magistrates of Lancaster County were in church celebrating Christmas, these vigilantes from the town of Paxton on the Pennsylvania frontier attacked the prison, broke in, and brutally massacred those 14 Conestogas, and that group included men, women, and young children. And it was a horrific massacre. Their bones, they were later buried in a Mennonite cemetery not too far away, and then in later centuries, actually, those bones were dug up to make room for a railroad. So we actually don't know what happened to those Indians, but that massacre did take place in that space, which is now effectively the basement, or and the surrounding grounds of the Fulton Theater. So that's a story that I grew up knowing about it as a kid, because I grew up in Lancaster. I worked in the Fulton. I attended plays there, and I've just never been able to let go of that story. I think it's a little like my first book about Garcia Lorca, a Spanish poet and playwright who was murdered at the start of the Spanish Civil War. I think one of the things that drives my writing is this notion of social justice and wanting to sort of bring to life again people who have been victims of these horrific crimes. And so I think that's a huge part of what motivated me to write this book, was to try to...
It's a pretty vivid portrayal, but it's the truth. That's what happened.
Well, and it was really a founding event in colonial history, because the murderers went on from Lancaster to Philadelphia. They were going to kill a whole group of Delaware Indians who were being held in kind of reservation. And actually a whole group of Quakers and administrators and officials from Philadelphia rode out to Germantown to stop them from attacking Philadelphia. Among that group was Benjamin Franklin, and they succeeded in getting these Paxton vigilantes to back down. Interestingly and sadly, they were never prosecuted for the crime of killing the Conestogas, the crime went unpunished. But the event itself led to this huge pamphlet war. Over 60 pamphlets were produced both for and against this massacre, and Ben Franklin wrote one of them, and happily, for those who are Franklin fans, he was vehemently opposed to the crime, and he talked about the barbarity and how could this happen in this country. So it just became this sort of cause célèbre, and it's clearly one of the early instances of the genocide of the American Indian. I mean, the killing didn't stop for another 100 years or longer.
Well, but this also shows that one of the delightful aspects of your book is your careful research. So what kind of research did you use to uncover this story?
Well, the Paxton Massacre, as it's largely known, has been written about quite a lot, and more and more books keep coming out about that incident and about Eastern Woodlands Indians and about the kinds of oppression that took place in the eastern United States. One of the people I met and befriended while working on this book was a man named Jack Brubaker, who has very recently published a long book and exploration of that incident, and actually of the historical interpretation of that massacre over the years, because that's a whole complicated and fascinating story. So Jack was actually incredibly helpful to me about this, and we used to get together for lunch whenever I'd go to Lancaster. We had long talks trying to figure out just where in the world that prison actually was, because it was, like many old buildings. I mean, they kept adding on to it and expanding it, and so, but it's fascinating when you go into the Fulton Theater today, which has been itself renovated multiple times in its history and is kind of a palimpsest of a building. But you go down into the basement and you turn a corner and there's a piece of stone wall from the old prison, and then you turn another corner. You go into the ladies' room where actresses, get dressed and primp before a show, and there's the stone wall of the prison. I mean, it's you can't avoid it. So it's really kind of this fascinating metaphor in a way for that part of American history. You think you're getting away from it, you think you've put it behind you, and then you turn into some sort of dark little tunnel, and there it is again, this terrible history that we have.
Well, one of the things that fascinated me is, to a certain extent, your writing reminded me of Wole Soyinka from Nigeria, where he was aware of the people, the presences in the third dimension. And by doing this research, you started bringing these other people alive who were part of the history. And that was fascinating, because there's all these people who influenced how the theater began.
Oh, sure. Well, one of the points I make with some frequency throughout the book is the idea that all theaters are ghosted, and they are. And you think about the activity that goes on in those buildings over the course of so many years. How many people have come onto that stage? I mean, at the height of the golden age of the American roadhouses in the mid and late 19th century, the Fulton was one of the great roadhouses, and people were coming in, shows were coming in frequently, every day. I mean, they'd load them up, they'd load them in the morning or whenever, they would perform, and then they would head off by train to the next theater, and these troops went around the country, and it was an extraordinary era, very tough on the actors who were doing that kind of traveling. But in any case, you think about, I have a couple of notebooks. There was a man named Ty Griner who many years ago did a thesis where he went through the local newspapers, and he just made a huge list of every show that played in that theater between 1852 and roughly 1930, when it became a movie house. And it fills a notebook like this, just the listing of the shows, over 10,000 of them during that time period. So it's just a deeply ghosted space. One of the things I did while working on this book was I asked a local ghost hunter who had done some research in the Fulton to come and meet me at the theater when we spent a morning there, and he brought his assistant out. And they brought all of this equipment, infrared recorders and cameras and all kinds of stuff. And we just traipsed around the theater and followed me around, and there we were standing on the stage of the theater, and he's snapping away, and his assistant is snapping away, and all of a sudden he said to me, I think we have a little friend here. So he beckoned me over to his camera, and I went, and sure enough, on the screen on the back, you could see a picture of me, and next to me was this little white orb. I don't know what it was. I don't know how it got there. He claimed it was a ghost. He said to me, theaters hold emotions, and any place that holds emotions is going to have ghosts. So I'm not a big believer in the paranormal, but I do know that the place is ghosted in ways that are just so resonant. I mean, when you're there, you're aware of people who've come before you and actors who've been there. There are posters of old shows all around the lobby of the theater. I mean, it's impossible to go in that building without thinking about people who've been there before you.
Why don't you mention some of the people who did come through there and played?
Sure. Well, some of the big names who came through there. Buffalo Bill performed there 6 times, and that's a particularly resonant aspect of the theater's history to me, because Buffalo Bill, of course, brought in bands and they were advertised as such, genuine Indians, and they were, and he got special permission from the U.S. government to take Native Americans off of their reservations and travel throughout the country performing plays where they were reenacting the genocide. And I wondered repeatedly as I was working on this book, did those Indians have any idea that when they were on that stage, that underneath that stage, on the ground underneath, the genocide of their fellow Indians began? I don't know. Minstrel shows came through by the dozens, by the scores. In fact, the first show to play Fulton Hall in 1852 was a minstrel show. And then later, some of the great African-American vocal groups came through. The Fisk Jubilee Singers came through. A wonderful performer named Bert Williams in the early 20th century, who was this fabulous African-American vaudeville star who reluctantly played. He was very light-skinned, but he found that if he put on blackface, he got bigger crowds, and so he, with a lot of mixed feelings, played in blackface. And he and his partner George Walker came through and performed several times at the Fulton. Sarah Bernhardt came through. Edwin Booth, one of the great actors of the 19th century American stage, and the brother of John Wilkes Booth, Lincoln's killer. He performed just once at the Fulton in 1886 to a sellout crowd. He's a fascinating figure. W.C. Fields, Ethel Barrymore, just amazing numbers of people coming through there. And then politicians as well. James Buchanan, President of the United States, appeared on the Fulton stage. He never seems to have spoken there, but he was a trustee of the local college, Franklin and Marshall, and so he would sit on stage during those commencement activities. Thaddeus Stevens, Lancaster's representative to Congress, did appear on the Fulton stage, not as an actor, but during the lead up to the Civil War, the stage was used for political conventions. And Thaddeus Stevens often took the stage, and he stood there and he decried slavery from that place, from that stage. And the press in those days was no kinder than it is now. In fact, I think in many ways it was nastier. And after one of his Stevens's appearances at the Fulton, the local Democratic paper said they criticized him and they mocked him, they ridiculed him because he had a club foot. And so in their paper they printed, "Thump, lump, lump, thump, the old heathen took the stage again."
Yeah. I mean, we've
come a little bit, we've improved a bit from those days. I don't think that would pass muster, certainly not in the mainstream press. So the stream of people who came through, I'm forgetting some, but it's really an astonishing group of people who've come through. And again, collectively, they kind of tell a story of the unfolding of American culture and really the development of an American identity, which was a lot of what was happening on these stages throughout the country in that time period.
One of the threads in the book are the people who established the theater and sustained it through the years.
Right, yeah. One of my big heroes in this book is a quirkily named man. His name was Blasius Yecker. He came over to America in 1848 as a 14-year-old immigrant from Germany. He had no money. He trained as a harness maker. My strong hunch, I was never able to conclusively prove it, and I searched like crazy to try to get proof, but I'm 99% sure that he got very wealthy during the Civil War making harnesses for the Army, for the Union Army, because actually one of his close friends and fellow immigrants did get rich that way. And so in 1865, at the end of the war, Blasius Yecker, this strange little harness maker from Germany, buys Fulton Hall and decides to go into show business. And he, for reasons I will never understand, he kind of wants to be a Barnum. And so he quickly renovates the theater, tries to improve it. He starts bringing in troops. And he struggles, and after a while he realizes he really has to renovate the theater because it's pretty run down, and the really high-class troops won't come in and play this rather disheveled building. So he hires an architect from Philadelphia in 1872. He guts the thing, he adds a balcony, turns it into a Victorian opera house with all of these sort of posh trappings. Interestingly, one of the things he was trying to do was make it respectable so that so that women and children would come in. And did you know that matinees were developed for women and children so that they could come to the theater without having their reputations somehow tarnished by coming at night? So anyhow, Blasius Yecker holds on to this theater until his death in 1903, and he goes through tough times and good times, and in the end he's really struggling, and his son eventually takes over the theater, and they're really struggling against movies because the moving pictures almost kill live theater. And in fact, the Fulton did become a movie house in 1930. The owners at that point finally threw up their hands and said, we can't compete any longer. But it did continue to stay open as a theater, and which is why it can lay claim to being the oldest continuously operating theater in the country. Eventually, in the 1950s, they reopened it and did they brought live theater back to the theater, to the Fulton. And then in the 60s, the kind of benighted period of American culture, the city thought, this ramshackled old building, and it was really in dire straits at that point. We're going to tear it down. We'll put a parking garage up in its place. But a group of local citizens, including one of the descendants of the man who originally built Fulton Hall in 1852, a local merchant named Christopher Hager, I think it was great-great-grandson, Nat Hager, was one of the leaders of a move in the 1960s. They got the theater put on the National Register of Historic Places, and at that point it was effectively saved, because you couldn't tear it down then. But they rallied, they raised money, they renovated the thing, and it's actually in very good shape now. And I just learned about a couple of weeks ago when I was out there, they are buying up the theater's going to buy up the entire block around it. They're going to further expand their space, and I'm not quite sure how they're going to do this, but they're actually going to somehow expand the backstage space so that they can start doing repertory, which is to say they would have several productions up at the same time, and they would bring them in and out. And right now they do, they run a show for 6 weeks and then they close it, and they're doing a lot of blockbuster stuff. They just did a big, hugely successful run of Les Mis this summer. They got to keep the place open, and they want to, they want to do these popular shows, but they also, to their immense credit, want to do tougher shows, tougher cells. And so if they can run it as a repertory theater, they can do, a couple of productions of a more difficult play, get smaller audiences for that, then pull it out, bring in their big splashy musical, fill the seats, make money. So it's the struggle to do theater, to pay for theater, never stops. It is not a lucrative field. It's a labor-intensive field, and there's really no way to get around that. You can't just, do assembly line stuff and get around your production costs. It's just incredibly costly to do live theater.
Well, in your book, you talk about all the things that they do just to keep going.
Right. Oh, gosh. Yeah, back in the 19th century, my hero Blasius Yecker, he would bring in all these leg shows, these sort of burlesque women shows, and he had to do it in such a way that he was always pushing the edge, it seems to me. But and they filled up the house with that. Buffalo Bill sold out the house every time he came through, except I think once. And Yecker brought in tons of other westerns and shows about Mormons and their multiple wives and all of this strange stuff. I think a lot of it was, the theatrical equivalent of reality TV or whatever it is that fills our, that pays the bills for TV shows these days. He brought in, again, minstrel shows, which were and so many productions of Uncle Tom's Cabin that the local press finally said, this is it, enough. We don't want to see this show anymore. We're so sick of it. The Uncle Tom's Cabin, interestingly, ran into the 1920s. I mean, eventually they were doing, it was sort of the Barnumization of theater. They did everything from, musical versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin. They would do double versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin, so you'd have two casts on stage simultaneously performing with all these dogs, barking and chasing Eliza and all of this sort of stuff. But just crazy sensationalist stuff. In 1910, when they were really fighting the onslaught of the movies, the management of the Fulton at that point brought in, I think twice, they brought in huge productions of Ben-Hur. They had a turntable on the stage. I found that really... And all of these horses, live horses, running around doing the Ben-Hur thing. And actually, this is a funny little aside, but when I launched the book in Lancaster in June, a friend of mine told this story. I'd never heard it. I so wish I could have included it in the book. But apparently, so the Fulton is in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is also Pennsylvania Dutch country. So there are a lot of very Pennsylvania Dutch names, one of which is Herr, H-E-R-R. I guess it comes from the German Herr, must be. So apparently, the horses arrived, or something like that, for the show Ben-Hur, and they didn't know where to deliver them, and they showed up at somebody's house in the outskirts of Lancaster. It was a Mr. Ben-Hur, H-E-R-R, and these horses were delivered to his house. I thought that was kind of a funny little aside story about that. But yeah, the struggle to, trying to balance legitimate theater, provocative, interesting theater with the stuff that's going to sell tickets. So Blasius Yecker also, to his credit, brought in productions of Ibsen. His production of Edwin Booth's Hamlet was one of the nations, I think, of high art. A great actor, a play by Shakespeare, but also a sellout crowd because Booth was so famous. Although, as was true wherever Booth went in the United States after 1865, people came as much to see Edwin Booth as they did to see the brother of Lincoln's assassin, and Booth was keenly, tragically aware of that. So, but in any case, yeah, the difficult balancing act that a manager of a theater runs. It's ask Ken Fisher of UMS. I mean, they've got to fill the seats, and they've got to pay for their more challenging fare somehow. It's always a balancing act.
One of the other threads was your own personal involvement with the theater, which was, I think you did just about everything you could do in the theater.
Yeah, there's not too much. I've never built a set there, but I was wanted to be an actress for years. So my first work in that theater was actually early on in my teens. I was part of a Christian theater group, and we wound up on the stage of the theater of the Fulton doing a concert first, and then I did a production of Anne Frank, and I played Anne Frank. And then later I went back to the theater. I worked as an apprentice. I made costumes. I ran lights. I did props. I was in the chorus of a musical about the Amish, not one I would recommend. And I performed there in college and whatnot. And then later I did children's theater, and I worked in the development office in the admin side of the theater. So I've kind of worn a bunch of different hats there. And I felt that I was kind of reluctant to put myself in the book because I just didn't want to write about myself and didn't want to do a memoir. But it did seem that in order to tell this story, I couldn't just recount, these 10,000 performances that took place over all these years. That would just be too tedious. So I eventually and kind of reluctantly concluded that you needed a guide to get you through this story. And so I thought that by doing my story and using that as kind of a frame, as well as the story of Blasius Yecker, because he really presided over the Fulton during its heyday as an American theater. I thought that those two frames might really help people sort of navigate all of the stuff that happened during those years. The other thing was I didn't really want to tell the 20th century story of the Fulton in great detail. I don't find it the most interesting part of the theater. Some others may, and they would be welcome to tell that story.
Well, I thought it was fascinating. You mentioned several times in the book about how the book keeps writing. It keeps going and keep finding more stuff about it.
Yeah. It's one of the great pleasures of working on any book when you get really deeply if you're doing any kind of research, when you get, or I've never done fiction, I'm imagining it's the same thing kind of happens when you're deeply, deeply into a book. But you're so immersed in it, you know so much at this point, you've learned so much and absorbed so much of it that these, the nuances and the really fine details that pop out at you just mean so much, and the connections that you can make that are just extraordinary. That's a real pleasure, and the discoveries that you make. So one of the things that happened really at the very, very end of the book, I can't quite remember. I guess there's a guy in Lancaster who's been doing a lot of research on the Underground Railroad, and he found out conclusively that the Fulton Theater, or more importantly the jail that used to be on that site, whose walls are the foundations of the Fulton, that jail was actually implicated in the Underground Railroad, and he was able to come up with enough proof to convince the I can't remember what entity it is in Washington that will designate a place, an Underground Railroad site. But in any case, this guy in Lancaster came up with the proof, and so while I was finishing up this book, the Fulton Theater became designated an official site of remembrance on the Underground Railroad. And that was really fascinating to me, and it got me going. And I was talking to somebody, I think at the Historical Society one day, one of the archivists, and which is always something anybody who's researching anything should do. You get into conversations with those guys because they will tell you stuff that you just wouldn't otherwise know. And this guy says to me, well, the jail actually was held runaway slaves, African Americans who were trying to get free. Many of them wound up in that jail, and I said, "You're kidding?" And he said, No, we've got all sorts of documents of jail sheets showing this." And so he went back and he produced some of these, and sure enough, here's 1810, Lancaster County Jail or Lancaster City Jail slaves. When they knew that they would have a sympathetic judge, they would do a habeas corpus case. I'm sure my language is not quite right on this, but they would take this person to that judge and say, basically, this person has not committed a crime, is guilty of no crime. And if they had a judge who was pro-abolition, that judge would free that runaway, and the African American would gain his or her freedom. And so again, here's this building, this prison that then becomes a theater. There's your metaphor. Not only housed the last of indigenous people, the Conestoga Indians, to inhabit Lancaster County when the land was still a wilderness, but it housed African Americans who were trying to escape slavery. I mean, how resonant.
Been a really interesting.
So another example of how reality and the portrayal of reality are ironically and disturbingly different.
To me, it's just so much more interesting than just living, right? I mean, I love my life, but to have this other life, it's just so wonderful. And I often think of, was it Margaret Mead, who said her father told her as a kid, if you can contribute anything to the world's knowledge, that's a good thing to do with your life. And so I'm hopeful with this that I've done that, at least in one small area.
I think you have. So thanks for being on Rip Rap again.
Thank you very much.